Hey guys, it's Libby and this is my October wrap-up. In October, I read 7 things. They were 2 audiobooks, 1 novel, and 4 plays, 2 by each of my lads. October was also Victober, but I decided to start out Victober by tackling the longest book I had on my TBR for that. So the first 3 that I'm going to talk about are not Victorian reads. I just finished them whilst I was slowly getting through Wives and Daughters. So the first play I finished was, of course, the Bard Book Club read for the month, and that was The Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare. Not going to talk about this too much because I made 2 whole videos about it. There's like almost an hour of Libby talking about this play. I made one video breaking down the first conversation that Catherine and Petruchio have because it is kind of tricky to understand, and then I talked about the whole play and its themes and sort of how you can do it in a modern in a modern era. In my official Taming of the Shrew Bard Book Club video. I do find this play very difficult to rate, and I would kind of prefer to not. I mean, I think I put down either 3 or 4 on Goodreads, but there's a lot going on here. Go watch my videos. Now, since the last 3 Bard Book Club plays have all ended fairly happily, and spoiler alert, next month's play, All's Well That Ends Well, does in fact end well, I decided I needed some Shakespearean doom and gloom, so I picked up Julius Caesar. I believe this is the Shakespeare play that contains the most suicides, if you include the one offstage suicide. But it's possible there's another one with more. But anyway, pretty doom and gloom. So if you don't know about the play Julius Caesar, I expect you know at least something about the man Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is not the main character. The main character is Brutus, who is another senator living in Rome towards the end of the Republic, and he in fact helps to bring about the end of the Republic accidentally. Politics is hard. Brutus is a friend of Julius Caesar, but he's kind of worried that Caesar's ambition will be bad for the Republic, and meanwhile there are some other senators who are plotting to assassinate Julius Caesar, and so they recruit Brutus into this, and then they kill Julius Caesar in basically the middle of the play. And then the second half of the play is about what happens to Brutus and another of the conspirators, Cassius, after they have killed Caesar, and it is like really good. I don't read Julius Caesar nearly as much as it deserves. I certainly read like technically worse plays more often than I read Julius Caesar. And so this was the first time that I had read Julius Caesar since like really getting into Coriolanus, which is a play about the Roman Republic supposedly at its height, but it's also like revealing all of the flaws that will eventually lead us here. And so it was really interesting reading Julius Caesar with Coriolanus in mind, because Coriolanus is basically a play entirely about bodies. It's full of body metaphors. Like what exactly is happening with Coriolanus's body is like the chief concern of the play, which means I really picked up on the extent to which Brutus's body is identified with the Roman Republic, but I won't go on too much about that lest I rob myself of things to say in the eventual Bard Book Club video that will be made for this play. Obviously, I gave Julius Caesar 5 stars. You should read it. It's not a terrible place to start with Shakespeare. Then my last non-Victober book was a very short novel, or possibly a novella, Chéri by Colette. Now, I read this in French, which was the language it was originally written in, which explains why it took me 6 months to read it, even though it is under 150 pages. This tackles the very French subject of a young person having lots and lots of extramarital sex with an older person. Seriously, like half of French novels are about that. But down to the particulars of Chéri. So our main character is a young man named Fred Pelou, who is known by the nickname Chéri, which in French basically just means like dear. His mother is a retired demi-mondaine, and he does not know who his father is. At the age of 19, he starts an affair with his mother's frenemy, like friend, rival, fellow demi-mondaine, who is about the same age as his mother. Her name is Leia. And they are happy for several years, but then Chéri, when he's in his mid-20s, needs to marry. He ends up getting married to Edmé, who is also the child of a demi-mondaine. I do not think any of the characters in this novel know who their dads are. And then it's kind of about how Chéri and Leia cope with life apart from each other. If you have heard of the author Colette recently, it's probably because of the film that is being made about her life starring Keira Knightley. I think the film is mainly about her abusive relationship with her spouse, who would like take credit for her work and that sort of stuff. And so I feel kind of bad in saying that this book was merely decent, but that is how I feel about it. I do give her credit for frequently creating very natural sounding dialogue, but the descriptions were really dragging down the prose of this story, mainly because there's just so much of them. Especially in the first third, it seems like Colette cannot refer to any part of anybody's body without using at least 3 adjectives. So Leia does not lift her hand. She lifts her soft, delicate hand in the manner of a something something, and her hand is attached to her wrist, which looks like a bright blue dove. I don't know. Her descriptions are slightly better than that. But it's just like, why are there so many words when you could have just said her hand? And this made the writing seem quite juvenile, and as I've said, this topic is one that has been well covered by French writers, and I didn't feel like this one was bringing anything like super new to the table. So I gave Chéri 3 stars. I did find it fairly easy to read in French, so if you like kind of speak French and you need a jumping off point into French literature, I think this would be a pretty good place to start. Now moving on to my Victober reads, I started off with the group read Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Now I am going to sound more down on this novel than I actually feel, and that's because well, with all books that I read, I go into them with some sort of expectation of what kind of a star rating I'm going to give it. Sometimes this is a hazy expectation, and sometimes it's quite concrete, and I was definitely going into this book with an expectation of it being 5 stars, and so I find it much easier to articulate the areas where it did not live up to my expectations, whereas if I had gone into this book thinking that it was going to be a 3-star book, I would have found it easy to articulate the parts that made me really like it. So I did give this book 4 stars. That is a good rating. I did like this book. Here are the reasons it is not 5 stars. Sorry, I should start with like a wee bit of a plot summary. So this takes place in the, I think it's like late 1820s, early 1830s, which is a couple of decades before the book was written. We are in a fairly small town in England. Our protagonist is Molly Gibson. She's a teenager. She is the daughter of a doctor, and one of her father's apprentices, student doctors, kind of has a crush on her, and her dad realizes this and is like, I need to remarry so that my daughter will have like a mother figure to shoo off any men who might try to be marrying my daughter. And so he marries this woman named Hyacinth Clare, who had formerly been the governess at the local big house to the fancy people, and is now rather unsuccessfully running a school. And Hyacinth turns out to be not the greatest person who has ever lived, but she does have a very interesting daughter named Cynthia, who's about Molly's age, who eventually comes to live with them, and it's about their interactions with various people in the town. I'd say the most important side characters we have are the Cumnors, who are a sort of very wealthy but newer money family, who were Hyacinth's employers. Then there are the Hamleys, who are an old established family from like before the Norman conquests, but they don't have as much money. And then there are the Miss Brownings, who are 2 cute spinster ladies. And I gotta say, part of the reason I was disappointed, though slightly, by this book is because I had seen the miniseries, and I'd seen it not a small number of times, and it is a very faithful adaptation. So I knew exactly what was going to happen at every point. I frequently could have told you what the next line was going to be because I knew it from the miniseries, and also I went through and looked at all of the chapter names, and I was like, oh, that's what happens in this chapter, that's what happens in this chapter, that's what happens in this chapter. So there was basically no intrigue for me, And at the start, I was kind of okay with that because the miniseries, there's also like not a lot of intrigue going on. But eventually, when we meet Cynthia and we discover the plot that involves Mr. Preston, in the miniseries, that's like incredibly tense and like, what's gonna happen? How are we gonna solve this problem? It's very interesting. Whereas, I don't know, in the novel, it just seemed like a little blip in Molly's country life. So that was a bit disappointing. I also found it very hard to be drawn in at the beginning because this is a third-person narrative, but we're kind of a little bit more in Molly's head than in anybody else's head, and so we are definitely seeing other characters from her perspective. And Molly basically does not like anybody. She likes her dad, but like I thought she was friends with the Miss Brownings, but whenever she's with them, like she seems to sometimes want to go hang out with them, but she always thinks of them as being annoying whenever she's with them, and she ends up staying with the Hamleys for a bit. She does eventually become good friends with this family. I expected things to start off on a fairly positive note, but she keeps talking about how Squire Hamley is kind of curmudgeonly and how his wife is an annoying, not infidel, that's the wrong word. What am I looking for? Invalid. That said, there were two elements to this book that I absolutely loved and found delightful and charming. And one of those was any conversation between any member of the Cumnor family. I really like the Cumnors. They're very rich. They don't care. The children are perfectly happy to snark at their parents. It actually kind of reminded me of a slightly more healthy version of the Longstaff family from The Way We Live Now. One of my favorite parts of The Way We Live Now are just like the Longstaffs. I imagine them all in their living room sort of lounging on divans and just complaining about each other. I like that sort of scene. And also, one thing that was not at all present in the miniseries, which was a delightful surprise, is all of these little hints that we get that Molly's father had like an illustrious history of romantic affairs before he married Molly's mother. That are just like barely mentioned. So here's an example. Dr. Gibson thinks to himself, "To be sure, poor Jeanie was not so old, and how I did love her." And then Elizabeth Gaskell adds in parentheses, "Mrs. Gibson's name was Mary, so he must have been referring to someone else." Truly the height of 1860s comedy. So I gave Wives and Daughters 4 stars. This does give me hope for her other very famous novel, North and South, because I believe that one has more plot to be going on with. Okay, then moving on to the 2 George Bernard Shaw plays that I read during Dewey's 24-hour readathon. Now, I did not do a vlog for this Dewey's, which is very unusual of me. And that's because I'm just having a really tough time adjusting to this new time zone for Dewey's. So I really liked it when I was living on the East Coast and I could get up at 8 a.m. Or, you know, I was generally I'm a morning person, so I was already up by 8 a.m. And then I could just dedicate my whole Saturday to reading, and then I would just go to bed and, like, not worry about the stuff early Sunday morning. But with this 2 p.m. to 2 p.m., it's just terrible, because that is, like, exactly the amount of time for me to do all of the things that I need to do in a day and then start something else. Honestly, I think if the readathon started at noon for me, I'd be able to swing it. But every time it comes around, I just like do all the stuff I need to do Saturday morning. I go to the grocery store, I do the laundry, and then it's like 12 o'clock, and I'm like, I've got 2 hours to kill. I don't want to start reading my books yet. I'll just do something else. And then I spend 2 hours like getting into something else, like researching a costuming thing or playing Skyrim. Yes, I still play Skyrim, even though that game is like 7 years old. I have heavily modded it. If you want suggestions for mods, talk to me in the comments. But then the start of the readathon comes around and I'm just like, I don't really want to read. Now, this may have something to do with the fact that all 3 readathons I have done since moving to Amsterdam, I have read, I believe, exclusively physical or digital books. I've either been listening to audiobooks or I've been reading my George Bernard Shaw plays, which I have a Kindle of. So what I'm gonna do next April is I'm gonna try to do the 2 p.m. to 2 p.m. or I think because of time zones and daylight savings time, it might actually be 1 p.m. to 1 p.m. for me in April. I think I'm gonna try to do that with like lots of physical books, because maybe I'm just missing the physicality of the books and like actually being able to see how I'm progressing with the turning of pages, because it's really hard to do that with Kindle, because I have all of George Bernard Shaw's public domain works in one giant Kindle book, which means like each play is only 1 or 2%. So I don't even have the satisfaction of like upping my percentage each time I turn a page. So yeah, hopefully the physical books will get me back into the readathon spirit, but if not, next October, I'm just gonna be reading on the Saturday, and I don't care what the actual times are. So that's why I didn't do a vlog, because I was just kind of bummed. But I did still get through some Victober appropriate reading. I read 2 George Bernard Shaw plays on Saturday afternoon, and then on Sunday, I just started my next novel, Jude the Obscure, because it seemed easier. So the first play that I read was The Devil's Disciple, which is set in New England, wanna say Massachusetts, but maybe it's one of the other ones, during the American Civil War. Nope, American Revolutionary War. We had a bunch of wars, and our focus is on this one puritanical family in which the patriarch has just died, and they are reading the will, and it turns out just about everything has been left to the one black sheep of the family. And of course, all this is happening when like the redcoats are about to be like marching down on their town and hanging rebels. I did like this play. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was a little bit heavy-handed, which is why it's not 5 stars. It's possible that I would have liked it better if I'd seen it on stage instead of reading it, because Shaw is a bit unusual for a playwright, especially an earlier playwright, in that he intended for his plays to be read as well as performed. So there's a lot of non-dialogue text, sort of giving you a sense of the characters, and I think some of the heavy-handedness may have come from the descriptions in the stage directions rather than the dialogue. But then I moved on to The Man of Destiny, and oh, you guys. Okay, so this is a 1-act play, which normally would mean like short, but this is a fairly long 1-act. You'd probably take like 50 minutes to an hour to perform. So if you were a theater, like you could present that as the evening's entertainment and not have people demanding their money back because you only gave them a 20-minute play. So this is about Napoleon. Fairly early in his career, he's still the consul, or one of the consuls. He has not yet been crowned emperor, and he is on campaign in Italy. We see him when he has sort of set up a little bit of a headquarters in an Italian inn, and there is a mysterious lady there who needs to get one of the letters that he has received in his correspondence. Now, the thing I liked so much about this play is that you are probably making assumptions about how the rest of this play is going to go down given the premise, and I can tell you that you are not imagining the right thing. George Bernard Shaw, when he wants to, can be very inventive and unconventional with plots, which is why I like him so much. I thought this play was fantastic and witty and surprising in all of the most satisfying ways. You should totally read it. I think it's a pretty good place to start with Shaw. Many Shaw plays are good places to start with Shaw, though not all. But this one is. I gave it 5 stars. And now moving on to my final Victober novel, I finally read Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This is the last of the novels of character and environments that I had to read. The novels of character environment, basically all of the famous novels by Thomas Hardy. And I was like, honestly, Libby, it's about time. You talk enough about Thomas Hardy that you need to have read this book. I think this book is most famous for being the wrong place to start with Thomas Hardy. This is true of my mom, and it's true of several people that I saw in the like TBR thread for Victober, of people saying like, man, I started with Jude the Obscure and it was miserable and now I don't want to read any more Hardy. Yes, it is miserable. So in the first couple chapters, we meet Jude when he is a child, and he is an orphan. He lives with his great aunt. She wasn't particularly interested in him. She really wants to learn and go to school, but his school teacher is leaving, and so he has to go to his job, which is basically like human scarecrow. His job is to keep the birds off of some farmer's corn, but then he thinks there's so much corn, and these pigeons look so hungry. I'll just let them eat. Go ahead, pigeons, eat some of the corn. And then his employer is like, are you fucking letting the pigeons eat the corn? What do you think I am paying you for? And then he beats him and fires him and sends him home. And the book pretty much goes downhill from there. Jude ends up being tricked into a marriage with this girl who is really not well suited for him, and they separate. She goes to Australia, and then he meets this other girl, who is his cousin, Sue Bridehead, who he thinks he might like a lot better, but unfortunately he is still married, and he's also trying to get into the college at Christminster, which is Thomas Hardy's name for Oxford. But although he has taught himself Latin and Greek, he knows that he doesn't have all of the advantages that he would need in order to get into the college, because he is a poor boy. And I will admit to being slightly nervous for the first third to half of this novel, because I wasn't like immediately sucked in. There's definitely fewer main characters than you'd find in Hardy's earlier work. This is definitely Jude's story, and then in the second half it sort of becomes Jude and Sue's story, and the other characters are distinctly side characters. They are not members of the ensemble, which means there was a lot less room for the intrigue and machinations and misunderstandings that are so great in books like The Woodlanders or The Return of the Native. But by the second half, I think we moved past the setup, and Hardy could actually talk about what he wanted to talk about, which was sexual ethics. And all the parts that had to do with that were incredibly fascinating while also being incredibly depressing. Jude and Sue have been brought up to believe that their family is cursed in marriage, and that if they ever get married, they will be very unhappy. They have confirmed this because they are both unhappily married, and so they kind of want to be together, but they also really don't want to get married. And this is all made even more complicated by the fact that Sue is possibly asexual. I'm hesitant to describe her as such because I don't think Thomas Hardy had that concept, and so he could not create a character who had that attribute. But she certainly seems very uninterested in having sex, even with Jude, with whom she is in love. And so we've got the whole complicated Venn diagram of what does it mean to be married to someone, as well as what does it mean to live with someone, as well as what does it mean to be having a sexual relationship with someone. And then compounded by the fact that they're living in a world full of Victorians who are like, this is all very straightforward. You get married, and then you live together, and then you get to have sex, and no other options are permitted. This really felt like a much more interesting rendition of an 18th century novel that I had DNF'd a month or two ago, which I have now forgotten the name of because it was not very good. Adeline Mowbray, which is about a couple who are living together outside of wedlock. But one of the big problems with that story was that all of the conflict was between the two of them and the outside world, and they had no conflict within themselves or between each other, which you definitely get in Jude the Obscure. So yeah, I thought this was really good, though I do absolutely believe that the Victorians would basically be like, stop writing novels to Thomas Hardy after they read this. I do not think they were ready for it. So the real question is, would I rather have Jude the Obscure, or would I rather have another 10 or 15 novels by Thomas Hardy that he had been able, that if instead of writing this very controversial book, he could have instead continued his career as a novelist and written books throughout the second half of his life, because he lived for like another 30 years. And I think I would prefer to have another, like, 10 Far From the Madding Crowds if it meant foregoing this one Jude the Obscure. However, that is not the way the cookie crumbled. I gave Jude the Obscure 5 stars. It's very good. You should read it. It should not be your first Thomas Hardy. So that's all of the books that I read in October. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I will see you again soon.